the early morning of January 30th, 1889, three men stood outside the bedchambers of Crown Prince Rudolph of House Habsburg, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Count Joseph Hoyos Sprinzenstein had spent the night in a nearby cottage at the prince's imperial hunting lodge, Mayerling. Rudolph's attendant, Johann Loschek, had called him earlier, informing him he had been unable to wake the prince. Minutes later, Rudolph's brother-in-law, Prince Philip of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, arrived at Mayerling. Loschek informed the men he had spoken to Prince Rudolph mere hours earlier and had been told to prepare breakfast and the horses for the day's hunt. He had also been told that under absolutely no reason should he be disturbed until 7:30 a.m. Hoyos and Philip agreed. Loschek would break down the door while they waited outside, but the lock wouldn't give. Loschek was forced to break through the wood panel so that he could reach through to the door handle on the inside. Within, he saw a woman's body, stiff and partially reclined on the bed. Next to her, slumped on the floor, was the prince, blood dripping from his open mouth. Both were dead.
From this point on, almost nothing can be agreed on. Different versions of events range from the plausible to the absurd. It was a scandal of its time.
The heir to one of the most powerful empires in the world, found dead under mysterious circumstances. What followed was a series of cover-ups and conflicting stories, destroyed reports and evidence, and even bizarre discoveries unearthed only a decade ago in 2015. Its far-reaching repercussions would alter the course of history and lead indirectly to the events surrounding the outbreak of World War I. To have a chance at piecing together what happened that night, we need to understand the central character of the Mayerling incident. 1. Rudolf Franz Karl Joseph, Archduke of Austria. By all accounts, an intelligent, handsome and charming young man, he excelled in his studies and took a keen interest in ornithology and hunting. His political leanings, though, were quite liberal, which for the time and his position were regarded as dangerous. His childhood wasn't a particularly happy one. His father, the emperor, paid him little attention, instead focusing on the outward appearance of the monarchy. A strict and authoritarian figure, his focus lied with the day-to-day activities and appointments of his kingdom. Not a particularly accomplished emperor, he was to eventually lead Austria down the road to ruin, culminating in the First World War and the collapse of the Habsburg dynasty. His mother, Empress Elizabeth, descended from the German house of Wittelsbach. Being wed to the emperor placed an enormous strain on her. She shied away from the limelight and the stress of court life. She had little time for Rudolph, as she had enough difficulty managing her own affairs. What is of particular interest is her family line. She was a cousin of the infamous Ludwig II, the Mad King of Bavaria, who built Neuschwanstein Castle. Her bloodline and her husband's were both heavily inbred. They both descended, in fact, from the same familial line, which resulted in not only physical abnormalities, but also mental. Madness was known to run in the family. Elizabeth was fixated with her appearance and maintained a weight of 50 kilos throughout her life, though she was very tall at 1.73 meters. She would eventually be assassinated by an anarchist, having never recovered from the death of her son.
At the age of 6, Rudolph was appointed a tutor, Leopold, Gondrecourt. This drill sergeant exposed the boy to emotional abuse, water treatments, and endless hours of exercise. It wasn't until his mother discovered what was happening that she put an end to it, but the damage was already done.
As he grew older, he took to drink and womanizing with gusto. He became notorious for charming the local gentry as well as prostitutes, who could hardly refuse a prince. Eventually he would marry Princess Stephanie of Belgium, but it was not to be an idyllic match. Far from the boisterous women he was used to, Stephanie was hot-tempered, plain, and uninterested. His father had hoped that Rudolph would settle down and fall in line with the family, but instead he pursued his amorous adventures even more vigorously. Throughout his marriage he had a consort, Missy Casper, an actress and prostitute, some would say the love of his life. However, she was also rumored to be a police informer and an agent of the German government. His affairs became so widespread that he would eventually contract peritonitis, an inflammation of the abdomen. Princess Stephanie was to suffer the same issue, which would result in the loss of her fallopian tubes. She had borne the prince a girl previously, but now there would be no heir. Though she recovered her health, the prince never did. Becoming ever more sick and frail as the years went by, it's highly likely he had infected her with gonorrhea, leading to both their illnesses. He would rely heavily on drink and morphine for the remainder of his life. When his body was discovered in Mayerling, it wasn't his mistress, Mizzy Casper, or his wife, Stephanie, beside him, but one Baroness Marie Alexandrine von Vetsera, Mary, age 17. The daughter of a wealthy family who had only recently gained nobility, her mother was focused on marrying her daughters off to royal bloodlines to increase her own stature. By all accounts, Mary was an average but pretty girl, friendly and outgoing, but with little interest in the more intellectual of pursuits. In October of 1888, the prince caught a glimpse of her at the opening of the new Burg Theater in Vienna. By early November, they formally met at the Prater, just outside Vienna, and by the 5th of November, she had a secret rendezvous with him at his apartments in the imperial palace of Hofburg. On the 19th, Rudolf would fall heavily from his horse. He complained for days after of stomach distress and headaches. Prince Philip would later say this fall
brought his brains into disorder,
hinting that this is what led to the tragedy at Mayerling. The romance continued with the two meeting when they could, but the prince still continued to see Mizzy Casper and likely other consorts.
On the night of December 11th, Wagner's Ring Cycle was to open at the Vienna Opera. Rudolph didn't attend, instead secretly seeing Mary, while she had excused herself from attending as well, feigning a headache.
Their secret romance would culminate on January 13th, 1889, Mary having written a letter stating,
"We both lost our heads and I became a woman. Now we belong to each other in body and soul."
To commemorate the occasion, he would present her a ring to be worn on a necklace with the letters ILVBIDT, standing for
In Liebe vereint bis in den Tod.
In love, united until death. On Sunday, the 27th of January, Rudolf and his wife Stephanie attended celebrations for the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, at the German embassy in Vienna. He was heard shouting at Stephanie,
"Go to blazes with your silly cloak,"
when she loudly ordered him to fetch her jacket. This was the last time he was seen in public. Accounts state his violent outburst resulted from an earlier argument he had had with his father, where he had expected the emperor to grant him a divorce since Stephanie could bear him no son. Instead, the emperor refused and warned him if he didn't start to act like a prince, he would ship him off to Sarajevo. Rudolf already had no political power or influence, a result of his liberal and unorthodox ideas. The next morning, he was summoned to the emperor once again, where the previous night's warning was reiterated. He gave Rudolf 1 week to make up his mind. The ultimatum, now, handed down. Rudolf stormed out of the room and retreated to Mayerling with his coachman, Bratfisch. Though this argument has been covered in newspapers of the time, there is a strong possibility that it never happened. Instead, a propagandist fabrication from the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Mary had been secreted into Mayerling around the same time, or possibly turned up unexpected and uninvited. We know almost nothing else of what happened on this day, but by 8 a.m. the next morning, Prince Philip and Count Hoyos would arrive at the lodge. Tuesday, 29th January, 1889, 1 day until incident. Rudolf complained of having caught a cold on the ride down from Vienna and insisted that the two gentlemen proceed on the hunt without him. His spirits were good, and they observed no signs of depression or anything unusual. That night, Rudolf had dinner with Hoyos, and Bratfisch attended them later in the night as he was a talented singer. Prince Philip had to return to Vienna early for a state function, which Rudolf had been expected to attend as well. He asked Philip to make his excuses to his father, as he didn't feel well enough to travel just yet.
The drinking, singing, and conversation lasted well into the night. Periodically through the evening, Rudolf excused himself to his study. Apparent suicide letters were found on his desk the next day.
Though Bratfisch recalled that there had been only one letter when the prince retired to his room that night. The next day, many more letters were found, seemingly appearing from nowhere. Rudolf had more than his fair share of drink, and at 3 a.m. they adjourned, with the understanding that they would reconvene at 9 a.m. for a day of hunting. Wednesday, 30th January 1889. 0 days until incident. At 6:10 a.m., the prince appeared to Leszek, fully dressed, and instructed him,
You must not let anyone see me, even if it is the Kaiser.
Until 7:30 a.m. Leszek, who slept adjacent to the prince's room, had seen Mary Vetsera the night before and had heard the two talking in serious tones throughout the night. They hadn't yet slept, and the prince advised he would nap for an hour. 6:35 a.m. Almost immediately after leaving the prince, Leszek heard 2 explosions. The timeline here differs as Leszek's account of events changed over the years. In his original testimony, he followed the prince's orders and did not return to his bedchambers until 7:30 a.m., despite hearing the gunshots. In a later retelling, he spoke to the prince at 7:40, not 6:35, and was instructed to prepare the breakfast and the horses. 2 gunshots heard mere moments later. In either scenario, the gunshots would have occurred at approximately 7:45 a.m. At 8 a.m., Count Hoyos was preparing to join the prince, having slept in a cottage on the lodge grounds when a servant rushed to call him to the main house. Leszek and the count banged on the door, but to no avail. Uncharacteristically for the prince, he had locked the door. The men feared the outcome of what barging into the prince's rooms uninvited would be, but something had to be done. At that very moment, Count Philip was just returning to Mayerling to join the hunt. The 3 men decided their next course of action would be to break down the door, but only Leszek would enter. The heavy door lock wouldn't break, so instead, Leszek smashed a section of the door in with his hammer to gain access to the lock on the inside. The room was dim. A woman's body lay on the bed, partially erect. Rigor mortis had already set in. She had been dead for some hours. On the floor, leaning against the bed, sat the prince, blood dripping from his open mouth. Leszek saw a glass of water on the table and immediately assumed the prince had been poisoned. Strychnine was known to cause bleeding from the mouth. Hoyos left immediately for Vienna to deliver the sad news to the emperor. Due to strict protocols, it was quite some time before the news finally reached him. He immediately cordoned off the lodge and began protocols to find out what had happened, and to cover it up if need be. The autopsy, reports, and letters have all since disappeared. The official story was that the prince had died of a heart aneurysm, the emperor still believing his son had been poisoned by Mary. In fact, they even tried to remove Mary from the scene altogether, claiming she was on her way to Venice when she had also died. They went so far as to having Mary's body propped up with a broomstick or a sword to appear alive as they had her hastily removed and buried in a secret plot in Heiligenkreuz. Her mother didn't even know her whereabouts for months.
Once reporters closed in on the scene, it was soon deduced that Mary had been with the prince. The crown quickly changed the story once their doctor informed the emperor that their son had clearly died from a gunshot wound to the head.
It was now reported as a murder-suicide. The prince had shot Mary, then waited some hours before taking his own life. 2 holes in the story now appear. The valet, Leszek, had claimed he heard 2 gunshots in quick succession that morning, but the body of Mary already showed signs of rigor mortis, meaning she had been dead for hours, while the prince was clearly very recently deceased. No reports of an earlier gunshot hours earlier avail. Leszek claimed he had also heard stern discussion from their bedchambers the entire night, so he was awake and an earlier gunshot would have surely raised the alarm. His room was adjoining the prince's. The second, more interesting report would only become known many years later. In 1959, Gerd Haller had Mary's body exhumed and autopsied. They claimed to have found no bullet hole in her head, nor anywhere on her body. Haller then proceeded to contact the Vatican to inquire on their official report of the Mayerling incident. The Vatican replied that there had only been 1 bullet fired that night. If we follow the lover-suicide pact theory, we find more evidence to support it. Letters were found from both Rudolph and Mary. The latter wrote to her mother,
Dear mother, please forgive me for what I've done. I could not resist love. In accordance with him, I want to be buried next to him in the cemetery of Alan. I am happier in death than life.
From Rudolph to his wife,
Dear Stephanie, you are relieved of my presence and vexations. Be happy in your own way. Be kind to the poor little one, who is all that remains to me. I go calmly to my end, which alone can save my good name. I embrace you warmly. Your loving Rudolph.
Furthermore, his other mistress, Mizzy Casper, claimed that Rudolf had proposed the idea of a murder-suicide pact to her as well. She had laughed the idea off, but seeing that he was earnest, she reported it to the police. They, of course, told her to keep her nose out of royal business. The rationale behind the murder-suicide was a combination of Rudolph's feelings of guilt in infecting his wife with gonorrhea and leaving her barren. He was also likely suffering from syphilis at the time, and already was known to be part of a bloodline which had numerous members suffering from insanity. Friends state that he often talked about and feared going mad one day. Add to this his troubled childhood and his father's rejection and ultimatum. His poetic beliefs might have led him to the conclusion that murder-suicide was the ultimate fate for star-crossed lovers, even though it's unlikely he felt Mary to be his true love.
If we back up a few steps, Rue recalled that the argument between father and son might have just been German propaganda. If so, what proof do we actually have that these suicide letters are authentic? In fact, it was in vogue at the time to forge such letters, and there were skilled artisans available to members of the state.
His suicide letter, by some accounts, was written 2 years prior, shortly before a dangerous trip to the Balkans. He had updated his will in the event that he didn't return at the same time. Besides this, his handwriting had changed in the past few years as his illnesses took their toll on him. He was an avid writer, so plenty of samples are available, but the original of this suicide note has disappeared conveniently, leaving us unable to make a handwriting comparison. This leads us down the path of murder. There are many theories regarding who had the most to gain from the prince's demise, and there is no shortage of potential suspects. Austria's larger, more powerful neighbor, Germany, always kept an eye on Austria while under the command of Otto von Bismarck. A staunch monarchist, he would be concerned about the crown prince's liberal and progressive ideas. It was no secret that the German chancellor disliked him and often insulted him. More so than just this, but Germany and Austria were going through weapon modernization programs. Rudolf was in charge of the Austrian efforts, and the results appeared to be very promising. However, the German efforts, despite assurances from Bismarck, was looking to become a fiasco. Emperor Wilhelm I had inspected the Austrian weapons and complained they were unfit and of poor design, going further to directly blame Rudolf for this. Wilhelm wanted Austria to cancel their program and follow his, not realizing or not caring that Austria's was actually far superior. The great nations of Europe were aware a war was coming very soon. Their calculations pointed to next year, though it would not be until 1914 when the Great War broke out. The modernization program currently being undertaken would supply the weapons for this war. This became a sticking point for Rudolf's father, the German emperor, and Bismarck. They demanded Rudolf's resignation, which he staunchly refused. He threatened them to court-martial him so all the evidence and proof would come out in the open. There, he would lay bare stories of gross incompetence, dangerous alliances, betrayal, insubordination, and treason. Eventually, the matter would snowball out of control, and this is when conspiracy theorists believe the murder of the prince was ordered, not just by the German emperor and chancellor, but by his own father as well. There is also evidence that Rudolf might have been planning to support a Hungarian rebellion, essentially a coup against his own father. Rudolf was quoted as saying that he knew too much and would be assassinated soon. It's likely he knew when and where it would happen, which is why he went to Mayerling. Perhaps he had consigned himself to his fate. He would either die by his own hand as a gentleman, or would hope and pray for his father to change his mind. But this wouldn't be enough. There would need to be provisions in place should Rudolf decide to fight. 10 commandos were stationed just within the perimeter of Mayerling. Apparent reports, which have since disappeared, claim the prince was actually shot twice. The final shot entering from the base of his skull, behind his left ear, and exiting through the top right of his head. A very difficult and unnecessary shot to make if it was indeed suicide. The prince was also right-handed. These lost reports also state that he was missing fingers and that his right hand was almost totally severed at the wrist. If he had been attacked with a sword, these would be typical defensive injuries. Then, while hurt and on his hands and knees, head down, a shot through the back of the head. Even the revolver used was not his own. All chambers had been fired, and the gun was nowhere near his body. There are even reports stating his head was found with green glass embedded in it, likely from a champagne bottle smashed over it. When Mary's body was exhumed, they found the skull to be disintegrating, which would occur over time due to hairline fractures, spiraling out from the point of impact. If she, too, had been hit with a bottle. Green glass was also found on her at the time. She was declared to have died 13 hours prior to Rudolph. That would be sometime around dinner the previous evening, meaning Rudolph would have had to interrupt his dinner to kill her, then return and continue drinking and laughing for hours more. The bedchamber was also found to be unheated and freezing cold.
Theirs weren't the only deaths that night either. The gamekeeper, Wiener, and his servant boy, Max. Even Rudolph's dog was dead, but these were deemed unrelated deaths somehow by authorities. A temporary cook who was at Mayerling disappeared that night. She was found dead weeks later in a hotel.
Another version of events state that Rudolph went to Mayerling, but had no intention of a rendezvous with Mary. He came with plenty of work, and women were rarely invited to Mayerling anyway. Mary made her way there with a fake invitation, apparently threatening the prince if he didn't allow her in. She either would have been kept in Stephanie's room, above the prince's, or in the lodge of the gamekeeper. In the middle of the night, the prince went to visit her at the gamekeeper's lodge, but the underkeeper, Wiedering, wasn't aware. When he knocked on the door, he saw a man jump from a window and escape into the night. He fired at the man, hitting him in the shoulder. Once he approached him, the man called out,
I am the Archduke, Rudolph. I am hit. Lead me to the Schloss.
Upon hearing the commotion, Mary appeared in the window. Fearing her prince dead, she swallowed poison. The prince made it to the lodge, but died soon after. The theories spiral out of control from this point, some claiming Mary castrated the prince so he murdered her and himself. Mary was pregnant and they had arranged an abortion, which went wrong. Mary's family members came to Mayerling to confront the prince, whereupon he accidentally shot Mary and they killed him. He faked his own death and Mary's and eloped to America.
Endless possibilities. But the answers to these questions are either destroyed or locked away deep in the Habsburg archives. What we do know is that the death of Prince Rudolph indirectly altered events leading to World War I.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the match that ignited the powder keg of the Great War. Had Rudolph lived, he would still have been the Archduke, and who knows how history might have changed. As soon as the Mayerling incident was over, the emperor ordered the lodge converted into a monastery for the nuns of the Discalced Carmelite order, which can still be visited today. The chapel, now in the exact location where the prince and Mary were found. To this day, the nuns say daily prayers so that the souls of Rudolph and Mary might be at peace.
The truth behind what actually happened that night is likely something that will never be revealed to the public. But maybe, like the letters discovered only 10 years ago, something will be found that sheds more light on the Mayerling incident. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more.